On the morning of the 2nd of September, 1621, as the sun barely peeked over the Khotyn fortress, the earth trembled. It was not an earthquake, but the sound of the most powerful war machine Europe had seen in generations. Hundreds of thousands of warriors appeared on the horizon. The Ottoman Empire advanced like a tsunami of steel, fire, and blood. Sultan Osman II, the 17-year-old ruler of an empire stretching from Baghdad to Algiers, personally led over 160,000 of his soldiers. They were joined by 60,000 Crimean Tatars on their steppe steeds, a total of over 220,000 warriors. Against them, sheltered behind hastily constructed field fortifications, stood only 50,000 defenders, Poles, Lithuanians, and Zaporozhian Cossacks, united not by love, but by desperation. They rallied, understanding that if Khotyn fell, the entire Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would be next. Leading this practically impossible defense was a man who should have already been dead. Karol Chodkiewicz, the Grand Hetman of Lithuania, was 61 years old and mortally ill. His body burned with fever, and he could barely stay in the saddle. Doctors implored him to stay in bed, but Chodkiewicz was not one to die in bed. 16 years prior, at Karol, he had commanded 4,000 men against 14,000 Swedes and routed them. 9,000 enemies fell then, while the Commonwealth lost only 100 men. He was a living legend, and now, facing his final battle, he understood it would be not just a defense, but a victory. The plains began to fill with Ottoman tents, deliberately spread wide so the Poles could gauge the true scale of the army come to destroy them. Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, sharpened their sabers. Sipahis polished their armor. Tatar archers checked their bowstrings. Chodkiewicz stood on the fortress wall, gazing at the endless sea of enemies. Young officers trembled. One whispered, "Hetman, it's impossible. How can we win?" The old warrior turned. His voice was calm but firm as steel. "Do not count the enemies, gentlemen. Count them with your sabers." That day, the battle began. A battle that would change the course of European history. It was not an ordinary clash. It was a planned annihilation that was meant to bury Ottoman ambitions and prove that even the greatest army in the world could be crushed by determination, brilliant strategy, and ruthless force, wielded by masters of war. If you want to know the full story of this battle, stay here, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell, because what happened over the next 38 days is beyond imagination. Europe was aflame. The year 1618 brought the beginning of a war that would consume the continent for 30 years. The 30 Years' War tore through Germany, France, and Spain. Catholics fought Protestants. The Habsburgs warred with anyone who stood in their way. And in this chaos, on Europe's eastern frontiers, another threat was brewing. The Ottoman Empire was at the peak of its territorial might. It controlled the Balkans, Greece, Hungary, Egypt, the Levant, and North Africa. Moldavia and Wallachia were vassal states of the Sultan. Constantinople dictated terms throughout the Black Sea region. And now, a young, ambitious sultan decided to advance further north. Osman II ascended the throne in 1618. He was only 14 years old. But unlike many Ottoman rulers who drowned in the luxury of harems and palace intrigues, Osman was different. Educated, ambitious, dangerous. He spoke Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Italian. He studied military art, wrote poetry, and, above all, strove to prove that he was a worthy successor to Suleiman the Magnificent. In 1620, he got his chance. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth interfered in the affairs of the Danubian principalities, supporting its candidates in Moldavia and Wallachia. For Osman, this was unacceptable. He sent an army under the command of Iskender Pasha, the governor of Ochakov. On the 20th of September 1620, near Sakura, a drama unfolded. The crown forces of the Commonwealth, under the command of Grand Crown Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski, faced superior Turkish forces. The battle was bloody and chaotic. The Poles fought bravely, but numbers decided the outcome. Żółkiewski, a 75-year-old veteran of countless battles, refused to flee. Surrounded by enemies, he fought to his last breath. He died with his saber in his hand. The Turks severed his head and sent it to Constantinople as a trophy. Field Crown Hetman Stanisław Koniecpolski was taken prisoner. Tatar horsemen rushed to plunder southern Poland, burning villages and taking thousands of people into slavery. News of the defeat at Sakura shocked the Commonwealth. The nobility, usually divided and indecisive, suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. The Sejm convened in Warsaw in early 1621. Debates were heated, but fear proved stronger than pride. Decisions were made to impose enormous taxes and a mass conscription of 65,000 soldiers. The entire Commonwealth was to become a military camp. Command of all troops was entrusted to one man, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz. He was born around 1,560 inches Lithuania into a magnate family. His father, Jan Chodkiewicz, held the post of Grand Marshal of Lithuania. Jan Karol's mother, Kristina Sparashka, came from a powerful lineage. Young Chodkiewicz received his initial education from the Jesuits at the Vilnius Academy. He then studied law and philosophy in Ingolstadt, Bavaria. He traveled through Italy, visited Padua, Venice, and Malta, and upon returning home, became an educated aristocrat. However, his destiny was predetermined, not by politics or diplomacy, but by war. He earned his first combat merits in battles against the Cossack uprising of Nalivaiko in 1596. This was followed by battles in Wallachia, under the leadership of Jan Zamoyski. It was there, in 1600, that Chodkiewicz fully proved himself. In the Battle of Ploiești, his detachment routed the Wallachian rebels. For his exploits, he was awarded the Field Mace of Lithuania, becoming the second most important military commander of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But his true legend was born in 1605. On September 27, under Kirchholm, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz led 3,900 men against 14,000 Swedes under the command of Duke Charles of Södermanland, the future King Charles IX. The enemy's superiority was overwhelming, almost 4-1. But Chodkiewicz did not falter. He skillfully used the terrain, placing infantry on elevations and artillery in key positions, and then threw in the Hussars. The winged horsemen in gleaming armor, with 5 or 6 meter lances, crashed into the center of the Swedish lines like a steel hammer. The enemy's formation broke. Panic spread through them like a plague. By the end of the battle, 9,000 Swedish dead lay on the battlefield, while the Poles lost only 100 men. 60 Swedish banners and a dozen cannons were captured. The Swedish camp was wiped off the face of the earth. Duke Charles of Södermanland himself had to flee, abandoning his army. All of Europe was amazed. Congratulations poured in from across the continent, from King James I of England, from Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, from Pope Paul V. Even Sultan Ahmed I sent a charter expressing his recognition. The irony of fate was that only 16 years later, Chodkiewicz would have to fight against the successor of this very sultan. After Kirchholm, Chodkiewicz was awarded the Great Mace of Lithuania, becoming the supreme military commander of the Grand Duchy. He participated in the Polish-Muscovite War, capturing Dorogobuzh, but his military campaigns often ended in soldier mutinies due to non-payment of wages. The Commonwealth was rich but inefficient. The nobility did not want to pay taxes, and soldiers revolted. Chodkiewicz resigned 10 times. But now, in 1621, there was no time for political intrigue. Osman II personally led the largest army the Ottoman Empire had sent north in decades. The forces were larger than at Mohacs, larger than at Vienna. It was a war machine designed for the complete annihilation of the Commonwealth. Chodkiewicz was 61 years old. He was gravely ill. Medics diagnosed him with a fever that was exhausting him. He coughed blood and could barely stand. Every ride on horseback turned into torture, but when King Sigismund III Vasa called him to service, he did not hesitate for a second. In July 1621, his troops concentrated in Lviv, 18,000 cavalry, 12,000 infantry, 22 cannons. They were joined by Zaporozhian Cossacks under Hetman Petro Konashevich Sahaidachny, numbering between 25,000 and 40,000 men, predominantly infantry and light cavalry, as well as Prince Władysław Vasa, the future king, who was to command the center. In total, about 50,000 warriors. Osman II led 160,000 Turks and 60,000 Tatars. Together, over 220,000 fighters. The arithmetic was ruthless, but Chodkiewicz was not a mathematician. He was a genius of war, and understood that larger armies had been defeated by smaller ones when led by the right person. On the 1st of August 1621, the Commonwealth Army encamped on the Dniester, opposite Khotyn. Chodkiewicz crossed the border, fulfilling his promise to the Cossacks. Now he had to begin building the greatest trap Europe had ever seen. On the 1st of August, 1621, the Commonwealth army stood on the banks of the Dniester. Chodkiewicz realized that time was working against him. Autumn was approaching. The planned Danube campaign was now impossible. Snow could begin as early as October, possibly even September. If the army got stuck deep in Moldavia, winter would consume it faster than any Turkish attack. The decision was made. There would be no offensive. There would be a defense, but not a passive defense behind fortress walls. Chodkiewicz conceived something far more deadly. Khotyn Castle was old, built by the Moldavians, small but strategically located on the Dniester. Chodkiewicz used it as a strongpoint. Behind the castle, the flank was protected by the river. In front lay hills covered by forests. Between the castle and the hills was an open field. It was here that Chodkiewicz began to build his trap. 8 kilometers of field fortifications, trenches 2 to 3 meters deep, palisades of sharpened stakes, artillery forts positioned so that every meter of approach was under fire, and in the center a huge camp. Hundreds of wagons arranged in a circle, connected by chains, filled with earth and stones, impenetrable to cavalry, deadly to infantry. The troops were deployed as follows. The left flank was personally commanded by Chodkiewicz. It was located closest to the castle and the Dniester. The center was entrusted to Crown Prince Władysław Vasa, a 26-year-old prince who had already fought in the Muscovite War and thirsted for blood. The right flank, closest to the hills, was occupied by Field Crown Hetman Stanisław Lubomirski. To the left of the left flank, Zaporozhian Cossacks built their own camp, a strong fortification of wagons and artillery. Each sector operated independently, had the capability for its own defense, but all were united into a single organism. If the Turks broke through in one place, they would immediately encounter the next. Chodkiewicz kept the most deadly in reserve: the Hussars, the winged horsemen, the elite of the Commonwealth's elite. Each Hussar was a nobleman or the son of a nobleman, trained from childhood. He wore plate armor weighing 20 kilograms, a lance 5 or 6 meters long. Behind his back, wings of eagle or goose feathers were attached, making a terrifying whistle on the gallop. The horses were specially bred, powerful, capable of carrying such weight and withstanding an attack. Chodkiewicz had about 3,000 hussars at his disposal. In the heat of battle, they could easily be crushed by the masses of Turkish infantry, but used as a mobile striking force, unleashed at key moments, they could break any attack. The July sun beat down. Soldiers dug trenches, hammered in palisades, carried water from the Dniester. The work was grueling, but everyone knew that every meter dug could mean the difference between life and death. At the end of July, scouts reported that the Sultan's army had moved from Adrianople. The news was terrifying. It was not an army. It was a migration. 160,000 Turks, Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, 30,000 to 40,000 men, Sipahis, Turkish cavalry, tens of thousands more, Azabs, auxiliary infantry, artillerymen with hundreds of guns, plus vassals, Moldavians, Wallachians, detachments from Anatolia, Kurds, Arabs, and then the Tatars. 60,000 horsemen from the Crimean steppes under the command of Khan Jenabet Giri. Lightly armed, fast, lethally effective archers. Their tactics were simple: surround, shoot, retreat, repeat. They didn't fight fair, they fought to win. In total, over 220,000 warriors. On August 16, the Ottoman vanguard reached Sitsora, the site of last year's slaughter. There, the entire army halted, rested, mobilized. Osman II personally conducted a review. The young sultan was full of confidence. Europe trembled at his name. He was a descendant of Suleiman the Magnificent, of Mehmed the Conqueror, and now he would show the world that the Ottoman dynasty was still invincible. On August 24, Polish scouts spotted the Turks on the horizon. The Sultan's army was on the move. On the 2nd of September, 1621, at noon, the Turkish vanguard arrived. The first thing the Poles saw was a cloud of dust, then horses, thousands of horses, then people, tens of thousands of people. The Ottoman army began setting up camp on the plain before the Polish fortifications. The tents were deliberately spread out over vast territories. They wanted the Poles to see the true scale of the army. to break their will to fight even before the first shot. In the Polish camp, silence fell. Soldiers looked at the sea of tents. Some began to pray. Others checked their weapons for the 10th time. Officers tried to maintain composure, but the fear was palpable. Chodkiewicz knew this was a critical moment. If his men broke now, the battle would be lost before it began. He rode along the line of fortifications. His voice was weak, weakened by illness, but the officers passed his words along. "Gentlemen, do not fear the enemy's numbers. You see how widely they have spread their tents. It's a circus. They want to scare you. But how many there are in reality, we will count with our sabers. You stand behind the best fortifications ever built on this land. You have artillery that will crush any attack. You have each other, and I assure you, the Turks will remember Khotyn for the next 100 years, not as a place of their triumph, but as a place of their slaughter." The soldiers regained their courage, not because the words were particularly eloquent, but because they were spoken by the man who had won at Kirchholm, the man who, with 4,000, had destroyed 14,000. If anyone could overcome the impossible, it was Karol Chodkiewicz. That evening, the Turks sent envoys. They called on the Poles to surrender. They offered safe retreat. All they had to do was leave Moldavia and recognize the Sultan's suzerainty over the Cossacks. The answer was brief: no. The night passed in silence. Both sides prepared. The Turks sharpened their sabers. The Poles reinforced their palisades. Everyone understood that real hell would break loose tomorrow. On September 3, shortly before dawn, the Poles were caught off guard. Most of the army was asleep. The sentries were exhausted after a full day of work on the fortifications. It was a mistake. The Janissaries struck. The Ottoman Empire's best infantry, 30,000 to 40,000 men, masters of sieges and assaults on fortifications, fell upon the right flank of the Polish line. They broke into the trenches, clambered over the palisades, and poured into the camp. Sabers flashed in the moonlight. The Polish infantry was caught sleeping. Hundreds died in the first minutes. Panic began, but Lubomirski, commanding the right flank, was an experienced veteran. He immediately mobilized reserves. Polish infantrymen with muskets began to form a line. Volleys of fire illuminated the night. Janissaries who had penetrated deepest were cut off and destroyed. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, saber against saber, pistols at close range. When the sun rose, the Janissaries were forced to retreat. They lost hundreds of fighters. The Poles lost about 100 infantrymen and several dozen wounded, but the psychological blow was immense. The Turks showed their deadly seriousness, and the Poles demonstrated that they would not be broken so easily. However, this was only the beginning. On September 8th, the Ottomans decided to attack another target. Sipahis Cossacks were escorting a supply convoy between their camp and the main Polish camp, several hundred wagons with provisions, gunpowder, and weapons. The temptation was too great to ignore. Janissaries and Tatar detachments, totaling about 10,000 men, moved to attack. The Cossacks saw them from afar. Instead of panic, they employed their favorite tactic. They let the enemy approach. The closer, the better. The Janissaries and Tatars charged at full gallop, confident of a quick victory. 500 meters, 300, 100. The Cossacks opened fire. 3,000 muskets fired simultaneously. Bullets whistled through the air like hail. The first line of Janissaries fell like mown grass. The second line fell upon the dead. The third tried to retreat, but the Tatars were pressing from behind. The Cossacks reloaded and fired again and again. When the smoke cleared, 3,000 Janissaries lay dead or dying. The Tatars retreated in panic. The convoy arrived safely. Osman II went mad with rage. His elite infantry had been destroyed by Cossack peasants. This was unacceptable. He summoned his commanders. The next attack would be massive. The next attack would be total, and he would lead it personally. On the 9th of September 1621, Osman II personally appeared before his commanders. The young sultan was furious. His Janissaries, the empire's elite, had been repulsed by the Poles. His Tatars had been routed by the Cossacks. Every day of delay was a humiliation. Every day that 50,000 Christians blocked the path of 220,000 warriors of Islam was a spit in the face of his honor. He ordered a general assault. On September 10, at dawn, The entire Ottoman army advanced. It was an unusual onslaught. It was a wave of men, iron, and fire that was meant to drown the Polish fortifications under sheer mass. Janissaries in front, followed by Sipahis, then Azabs. Thousands of auxiliary infantry. Tatars circled the flanks, firing their bows. Ottoman artillery opened fire. Dozens of cannons, hurling missiles and balls, carving bloody corridors in the Polish lines. Polish artillery responded. 2 cannons were few compared to hundreds of Ottoman guns, but the Polish gunners were masters of their craft. They didn't shoot at random. They aimed. Every shot had meaning. Cannonballs fell into the dense formations of Janissaries, tearing them to pieces. One shot killed 5, 6, 7. Pieces of bodies flew into the air. The cries of the wounded filled the battlefield, but the Turks still advanced. Tens of thousands reached the trenches. They began to descend, to climb the other side. Polish infantry waited at the palisades. As the Janissaries were halfway, defenseless, the Poles opened fire with muskets. Volley after volley, Janissaries fell back into the trenches onto the bodies of their comrades. But some managed to break through. They leaped over the palisades. They burst into the first line of fortifications. Sabers flashed. Polish infantry fought in tight formations. Spears and sabers against Turkish saber pistols. There were brutal battles without mercy. Every fallen man died. Chodkiewicz watched from the left flank. He saw that the center was beginning to weaken. There were too many Janissaries. For everyone killed, 2 new ones arrived. Lubomirsky on the right flank also had problems. Tatars tried to outflank them from the hills to fire on the rear. The Hetman made a decision. He gave the signal. 3 Hussar, Karol, advanced from the reserve. About 650 horsemen in full plate armor, with lances raised and wings on their backs, emitting a deadly whistle. The horses thundered at full gallop. The earth shook under their hooves. They struck the flank of the Janissary formation, which had penetrated deepest into the Polish fortifications. The Hussars at full gallop were unstoppable. Lances 5 or 6 meters long pierced 2 or 3 men at once. Horses, each weighing half a ton, trampled everything in their path. The Janissaries tried to resist, but nothing could stop the steel avalanche. Within 5 minutes, 1,000 Janissaries were crushed. The Turkish formation disintegrated. Panic spread. The Janissaries began to retreat, slowly at first, then running. The Hussars wheeled, regrouped, and charged again and again. Each charge claimed hundreds of enemies. When they withdrew back behind the fortifications, the field before the Polish positions was strewn with bodies, but the Turks did not give up. The next day, they attacked again and again throughout September. Each day brought a new assault, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. The Ottoman army was so vast that it could rotate fresh units. Janissaries attacked in the morning, Sipahis in the afternoon, Azabs in the evening. The Poles did not have such luxury. The same soldiers fought from dawn till dusk, slept a few hours, and stood on the walls again. The wounded who could hold a musket returned to the fight. The dead were buried at night in mass graves dug behind the camp. Polish artillery worked without interruption. The gunners became so accurate that they could hit individual commanders at a distance of 500 meters. Ottoman pashas began to fear leading their units. Cannonballs tore their heads from their shoulders. On September 15, the Turks changed tactics. Instead of frontal assaults, they decided to use deception. At night, a small group of Janissaries infiltrated the Polish trenches, passed through the palisades, and hid in the woods behind the right flank. They planned to attack from the rear during the next assault, but Polish scouts discovered them. The information reached Lubomirsky. Instead of attacking them, he ordered his men to pretend they knew nothing, and when, at dawn, the Janissaries emerged from hiding and moved to attack, the Polish units were already ready. They surrounded them, and not a single Janissary survived. On September 20, Osman II began to understand the truth. This battle would not be a quick victory. The Poles would not break. Each attack cost thousands of men, and winter was approaching faster. The nights were already cold. Soon, snow would begin to fall. If the army had to retreat through the snowy Balkans, the losses would be catastrophic. But to retreat now meant admitting defeat, and the young Sultan would rather die than return to Constantinople a coward. On the 24th of September 1621, in Khotyn Castle, Karol Chodkiewicz lay in bed. Fever burned his body like fire. He could barely speak. The doctors knew it was the end. The hetman knew the same. He summoned Stanisław Lubomirski, the field crown hetman. He handed him his mace. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. Stanisław, the army is yours. Hold the defense. Do not let them pass. Winter will destroy them if you don't let them now. Lubomirski took the mace. Tears streamed down his face. Chodkiewicz, a living legend, a man who had won at Kirchholm, survived dozens of campaigns, was dying not from an enemy bullet, but from illness. That evening, Karol Chodkiewicz passed away. He was 61 years old. His body was wrapped in a shroud and temporarily buried in the castle dungeons. News of his death immediately spread through the camp. The soldiers were devastated. Some wept openly. Officers tried to maintain order, but everyone knew they had just lost their greatest leader. The news also reached the Turks. On September 25, at dawn, Osman II ordered a massive assault. He believed the Poles would be demoralized, that their defense would collapse. He sent tens of thousands of Janissaries and Sipahis, but Lubomirski, supported by Crown Prince Władysław, held the defense. The Poles fought with a fury born of desperation. Every soldier wanted to avenge the hetman's death. When the Janissaries reached the palisades, they met such dense musket fire that the air blackened with smoke. Polish infantrymen fought like madmen. Hussars attacked again, breaking through Turkish formations. By evening, the Turks retreated, leaving thousands dead. On September 28, Osman II ordered a final major assault. This time he targeted the weakly fortified positions of the Leshnikowi, light cavalry on the edge of the right flank. He believed this would be the weakest point. The Leshnikowi were known for their brutality. Mercenaries. They fought in the 30 Years' War for the Habsburgs. They burned, plundered, took no prisoners. Now they stood to defend their land. The Turks advanced, but the Leshnikowi did not flee. They fought furiously, like savages, using all the tricks they knew. They feigned retreat, luring the Turks into ambushes, firing at their backs, staging night raids. The assault ended in failure. The Turkish army lost several thousand more men. That evening, in the Sultan's tent, Osman II sat in absolute silence. His commanders stood around him. All understood the truth. This campaign had turned into a disaster. Losses numbered in the tens of thousands. Some sources say 40,000 killed, others 60,000, and a third group 80,000. The exact number remained unknown, but the field before the Polish fortifications, for kilometers, was strewn with bodies. Added to this were diseases: dysentery, typhus, fever. Soldiers died in tents faster than on the battlefield. The water in the Dniester became contaminated with blood and corpses. Food was running out, horses were dying of starvation, and winter was approaching. The temperature dropped every night. Soon, snow would fall. A march through the Balkans in winter with a sick and starving army would be a true nightmare. Thousands would freeze. Thousands would die of exhaustion. Osman II realized the necessity of negotiations, but conducting them from a position of weakness meant humiliation. The young Sultan, who had promised to crush the Poles and conquer the entire Commonwealth, was now forced to ask for peace. However, he had no choice. He sent envoys. The Poles received them with caution. Negotiations began. While diplomats engaged in dialogue, hostilities did not cease entirely. Minor skirmishes occurred daily. Jaxos. Tatars still tried to outflank Polish positions to plunder supplies. Polish patrols tracked them in the forests. Bodies were left as a warning. In the Polish camp, the situation was also desperate. According to legend, they had only one barrel of gunpowder left. If the Turks attacked again with full force, the Poles would have nothing to shoot with. Sabers and spears against tens of thousands of Janissaries. It would be a slaughter. But the Turks didn't know this. They saw only impregnable fortifications. They saw only a field strewn with their own corpses. They saw only the approaching winter. Negotiations lasted several days. The Polish side was represented by Jakub Sobieski, father of the future King Jan Dwór Sobieski, and Stanisław Żółkiewski, Castellan of Belsk. The Turkish side was represented by the Grand Vizier Deli Hüseyin Pasha. Each point of the treaty had to be translated 3 times. From Polish to Romanian, from Romanian to Greek, from Greek to Turkish. The process was slow, exhausting, but both sides were eager for completion. Finally, on the 9th of October 1621, the treaty was signed. The border was confirmed along the Dniester River. Moldavia remained under Ottoman control. The Cossacks were recognized as a force to be reckoned with. The main point allowed both sides to declare victory. The Polish version of the treaty spoke of traditional gifts to the Khan, courteous offerings between rulers. The Turkish version of the same paragraph, however, treated it as tribute. Each side could return home and proclaim triumph. On October 10, Osman II's army began its retreat south. Columns of troops stretched for kilometers. Sick, wounded, hungry. It was not the glorious retreat of a victorious army. It was the march of broken men. The Poles watched from the fortifications. Some soldiers wanted to attack to finish off the enemy, but Lubomirski forbade it. The treaty was signed, honor was preserved, and, most importantly, the Polish army was also on the verge of collapse. 1 barrel of gunpowder, food supplies for a few days. If the fighting had continued, they too would have fallen. The Battle of Khotyn concluded. 38 days of fighting, tens of thousands killed. And yet, the Commonwealth held out. On the 9th of October 1621, the peace treaty was officially announced. Both armies stood opposite each other, exhausted, bleeding, but still ready to fight if negotiations had failed at the last moment. Jakub Sobieski and Stanisław Żółkiewski emerged from the negotiation tent with documents in hand. Their faces did not express triumph, they expressed relief. On the other side, the Grand Vizier, Deli Hussein Pasha, also held his copy. Both sides knew this was not a victory, but survival. The main points of the treaty were simple in theory, but devilishly complex in their details. The border between the Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire remained along the Dniester River. Neither side gained or lost territory. Moldavia and Wallachia remained under the Sultan's suzerainty. The Commonwealth acknowledged this fact. The Ottomans promised to stop Tatar raids on Polish lands, a promise worth as much as the paper it was written on. But the most important point, the one that allowed both sides to return home with their heads held high, concerned the Cossacks and tribute. In the Polish version of the treaty, it spoke of traditional gifts for the Crimean Khan, courteous offerings between rulers. However, the Turkish version of the same paragraph contained the word karaj, meaning tribute paid by the vanquished to the victor. This was a true diplomatic triumph. Each side could interpret the text as it saw fit. The Poles, returning to Warsaw, declared they were not paying tribute, but merely offering gifts. The Turks, arriving in Istanbul, claimed the Poles had paid haraj. Everyone was satisfied, at least officially. The reality was far more brutal. The Polish army lost thousands of soldiers. Exact figures vary. Sources indicate 3,000 to 5,000 killed and died of disease. Added to this were thousands wounded, many of whom never fully recovered. But the most painful loss was not the numerical one. On September 24, Karol Chodkiewicz, the greatest commander of his generation, died. His body was first temporarily buried in Khotyn, and then transported to Kamianets-Podilsky, where he was interred on October 14. His funeral was solemn but mournful. Poland had lost a living legend. A few months later, Petro Konashevich Sahaydachny, the hetman of the Cossacks, also died. Wounds sustained in battle did not heal. Infection set in. He died in torment, in fever, surrounded by his soldiers. The Cossacks lost a leader who could combine their untamed independence with military discipline. For the Commonwealth, the deaths of these two men were a blow almost as heavy as a lost battle. Chodkiewicz and Sahaydachny were irreplaceable. Their successors were competent, but lacked their authority, their legend. However, despite the losses, euphoria reigned in Poland and Lithuania. News of the defense of Khotyn spread like wildfire. 50,000 soldiers stopped over 200,000 Turks. It was a miracle, a sign of divine intervention. The clergy preached about how God had protected Christian Europe from the Islamic flood. The poet Wacław Potocki would later write an epic poem, The War of Khotyn, describing the battle in Homeric style. Samuel Twardowski created his work while memories were still fresh. Jakub Sobieski, one of the negotiators, wrote Commentariorum Chotinensis Belli Libri Tres, a detailed diary of the campaign, published in 1646. Khotyn became part of Polish national mythology, a place where the nobility, townspeople, Cossacks, and peasants stood shoulder to shoulder against the enemy, a place where honor was more precious than life. But on the other side of the border, the atmosphere was much darker. On the 27th of December, 1621, Osman II entered Istanbul. A victory parade was organized. 3 days and 3 nights of celebrations. The streets were decorated. People cheered for the Sultan. Official propaganda proclaimed a great victory over the infidels. But Osman II knew the truth. He sat in his palace, surrounded by courtiers congratulating him on his triumph, and felt only anger. This was not a victory. It was a defeat, masked by diplomatic fiction. 40,000 to 80,000 soldiers did not return. The fields near Khotyn were strewn with Turkish bones. Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry, had been humiliated by Polish peasants with muskets. Tatars, who were supposed to tear through Polish lines, had been repulsed with immense losses. And, worse, the Janissaries had behaved like cowards. They refused to obey orders. They demanded extra money before every attack. When the Sultan ordered an attack, some units simply stood still. A culture of corruption and disobedience had infiltrated the heart of what was once the most disciplined force in the world. Osman II was young, only 18 years old, but not stupid. He knew the empire was rotting from within. The Janissaries had become a political class, a pressure group that could dictate terms to the Sultan himself. This was unacceptable. He began to plan a reform, a radical, all-encompassing reform that would destroy the old order and create a new empire. Clear's throat. But before he could do that, he had to get rid of the Janissaries, and that decision cost him the highest price. Meanwhile, in the Commonwealth, life slowly returned to normal. Soldiers returned home. Many carried physical and mental scars. They told stories of Khotyn in taverns, markets, and churches. With each retelling, the stories became more heroic. The Sejm convened to discuss the results of the campaign. Debates were fierce. Some deputies argued that Poland should have continued the war, invaded Moldavia, forced the Turks to make greater concessions. Others argued that peace was the best possible outcome under the circumstances. Finally, an official interpretation was adopted. Khotyn was a great victory. Poland had saved not only itself but all of Christian Europe. And the most tragic element of this narrative was the truth. Had the Turks broken through the defense at Khotyn, all of Eastern Europe would have been open. Hungary, already partially under Ottoman control, would have been completely subjugated. Next, Austria would fall, and from there, the path would be open to Germany and Italy. Khotyn became a turning point, the place where the tide of Ottoman expansion was stopped, not permanently, as 52 years later the Turks would again be at Vienna, but long enough for Europe to prepare. And in that preparation, the memory of Khotyn played a key role. When Jan II Sobieski, son of Jakub Sobieski, who negotiated the treaty, led Polish Hussars to the aid of Vienna in 1683, he would remember his father's stories of Khotyn. He would know that Turks could be defeated, that numbers were not everything, that courage, strategy, and determination could overcome even the greatest advantage. But all this was in the future. In 1621, the Commonwealth buried its heroes, healed its wounds, and prepared for new trials. Because in Eastern Europe, peace never lasted long. Osman II could not sleep. Every night in his chambers in the Topkapi Palace, he saw their faces, Janissaries standing motionless when he ordered an attack, Sipahis fleeing from Polish Hussars, great pashas demanding gold before carrying out every order. The empire built by Mehmed the Conqueror, expanded by Suleiman the Magnificent, was now rotting from within from corruption and cowardice. The young sultan was obsessed with an idea. The Janissaries must be destroyed, not reformed, not disciplined, but completely annihilated. He began to develop a secret, radical, dangerous plan. He would create a new army, not from urban Janissaries who spent more time in coffee houses than on the battlefield, but from Anatolian peasants, simple, unyielding people from the villages and mountains of Anatolia. He would also recruit Arab, Kurdish, and Druze mercenaries. All would be armed with muskets, modern weapons, not outdated bows and sabers. And most importantly, they would be loyal only to him, not to their core, not to their traditions, only to the Sultan. But this was only the beginning of his plan. Osman II wanted to move the empire's capital from Constantinople to Damascus, from the European shore to the Asian heart of the empire. There, away from the intrigues of Janissaries and courtly influences, he could rule absolutely, and he planned to do something no sultan had done before him, a pilgrimage to Mecca. The Hajj, officially, to show piety, unofficially, to recruit a new army along the way. Away from the eyes of the Janissaries in Constantinople. The Janissaries were not stupid. Spies were everywhere. They heard rumors and understood what the Sultan was planning. They understood that their days were numbered, and the Janissaries were not going to die quietly. On the 12th of January 1622, in the middle of winter, something strange happened. Prince Mehmed, Osman II's younger brother, was found dead. Officially, natural causes. Unofficially, everyone knew he was killed on the Sultan's orders. Osman was eliminating potential rivals. On the same day, a blizzard began, the worst in a decade. The Bosphorus froze. Constantinople was cut off from supplies. People froze in their homes. Food disappeared from the markets. Prices soared. The poor began to die of hunger and cold. On January 24, violence erupted on the streets. Starving crowds attacked shops, looted warehouses. Constantinople plunged into chaos, and the Janissaries watched and waited. Osman II tried to continue his plans. In the autumn of 1621, returning from the Khotyn campaign, he stopped in Edirne. There, he learned of the birth of a son, Prince Ahmed. A grand celebration was organized. Part of the ceremony was a reenactment of battles in Poland. Cannons fired, cavalry charged, infantry simulated an attack. During this performance, a tragedy occurred. An accidental bullet struck the infant. Prince Ahmed died on the spot. He was only 3 months old. According to other versions, the child died of shock caused by the noise of the cannons. Regardless of the cause, the Sultan's son was dead. Osman II was devastated, but he did not abandon his plans. Moreover, he became even more resolute. The empire must be reformed at any cost. In May 1622, the Sultan began implementing his reforms. He ordered the closure of Janissary coffeehouses. These places were centers of conspiracy, where soldiers planned mutinies and discussed overthrowing unwanted rulers. Now they were closed. The Janissaries were enraged. Then Osman announced he would go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He would take a small escort, and the rest of the court would remain in Constantinople. Everyone knew what this really meant. He would leave the city, recruit a new army, return, and carry out a massacre of the Janissaries. The Janissaries decided to strike first. On the 18th of May 1622, the day Osman II was to leave Constantinople, a rebellion broke out. It began calmly. Crowds of Janissaries began to gather in the squares. At first, they just talked, then shouts erupted, and after that, they took up arms. They were joined by the shockherds of the madrasa, students of religious schools. The rebellion was financed by wealthy merchants connected to the Janissaries. Within hours, the city was ablaze, and the crowd moved towards the Sultan's palace in search of the culprits. The first they found was Suleiman Agha, the chief eunuch, the Sultan's closest advisor. He was apprehended in the palace gardens, immediately killed, and dismembered like wild beasts. Osman II hid in his chambers, summoning the guard, but half the guards had already defected to the rebels. He realized his end was near. The Sultan attempted to flee, disguised as a simple servant, and making his way through secret corridors. He almost managed to get out of the palace, but someone recognized him. A cry echoed through the courtyards. "The Sultan! We've caught the Sultan!" He was seized. The 18-year-old, young and frightened. He begged for mercy, promising gold, forgiveness, anything. The Janissaries merely laughed. He was dragged to the Yetikul fortress, an old citadel on the outskirts of the city. There, in a dark cell, Osman II spent his last hours. He understood his fate. He knew that no sultan before him had ever been executed by his own soldiers. He was destined to be the first. On the 20th of May, 1622, the Janissaries entered his dungeon. They did not use a quick death, neither sword nor shot. They employed strangulation, a slow, agonizing, and humiliating process. Osman II struggled, resisted, tried to shout, but the rope tightened. Within minutes, he stopped moving. When his body cooled, The Janissaries cut off his ear. Some sources claim his nose as well. These body parts were delivered to Halime Sultan, Osman's grandmother, and Sultan Mustafa, Osman's uncle, who was now reinstated on the throne. The gifts were meant to confirm that Osman was truly dead and that Mustafa could rule without fear. This was the first instance in Ottoman history where a sultan was executed by the Janissaries. A precedent was set. Sultans ceased to be untouchable. They could be overthrown. They could be killed. Power shifted from the palace to the barracks. The murder of Osman II became one of the most described events in Ottoman historiography. Chroniclers like Hasan Beyzade, Karaçelebizade, Solakzade, Peçevi, Müneccimbaşı, and Naim left detailed accounts. Khatib Çelebi described it in his Fezleke partly as a history, partly as a warning. For the next 200 years, in the coffee houses of Constantinople, public storytellers recited poems about the young Osman, his ambitious plans, his Khotyn campaign, and his tragic death at the hands of those he trusted most. He became a tragic figure, a hero who tried to reform the empire and was killed for it. But for the Janissaries, his death was a victory. They proved they were untouchable, that they could dictate terms, that they were the true rulers of the empire. These beliefs would cost them dearly. Not immediately, not within a decade, but eventually. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II would complete what Osman II had started. The Janissary Corps would be completely destroyed in what was known as the Auspicious Incident. Thousands of Janissaries would be killed, their barracks burned, their traditions erased. But all this was 200 years later. In 1622, the Janissaries celebrated. Osman was dead. Mustafa returned to the throne, becoming a puppet in their hands. The empire belonged to them, and near Khotyn, Polish bones mixed with Turkish ones, slowly disappearing into the earth. The battlefield that changed the course of history, the Battle of Khotyn, ended 38 days after it began. 38 days of relentless violence, blood, strategy, and survival. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried, Europe began to realize what had truly happened. This was not an ordinary battle. It was a turning point in the continent's history. Karol Chodkiewicz's genius lay not in defeating the enemy, in a classic sense. He did not rout the Ottoman army in open battle. He did not capture their banners in a dramatic charge. His genius lay in transforming a fundamental weakness into an unassailable strength. 50,000 soldiers against over 220,000. An open engagement in an open field would have been a massacre. The Poles would have been surrounded, broken, destroyed, in a matter of hours. But Chodkiewicz did not fight in an open field. He created a labyrinth of death, 8 square kilometers of trenches, palisades, artillery forts, encampments. Every meter the Turks had to win back cost them hundreds of lives. And then came the counterattacks. The Hussars did not hold the line. They were used as a steel hammer, striking precisely when and where the Turkish lines were most stretched. 650 winged horsemen, attacking the flank of 10,000 Janissaries. The effect was devastating. The Hussars did not aim to kill everyone, but their appearance undermined the enemy's morale, destroyed their formations, and sowed panic. The lesson was clear. In defense, terrain matters more than numbers. Skillfully designed fortifications can increase the strength of each defender tenfold, and timely use of a mobile reserve can decide the outcome of a battle, regardless of the enemy's overwhelming numerical superiority. However, Khotyn taught more than just military tactics. Chodkiewicz commanded while he was dying. His body burned with fever. Every day he fought to maintain consciousness, and every order was given through clenched teeth. He died on September 24, 2 weeks before the end of the battle. But even his death did not break the Polish defense. This was an example of true leadership. A true leader is indispensable not because he does everything himself, but because he creates a system capable of functioning even in his absence. Chodkiewicz trained his officers. He trusted Lubomirski, Crown Prince Władysław, and the Hussar commanders. After his death, the system continued to work. This became his true masterpiece. For Sultan Osman II, Khotyn became the beginning of the end. The young ruler returned home with an army that had lost tens of thousands of warriors. He returned to an empire that expected victory and received a compromise peace treaty. He returned to the Janissaries, who saw his weakness and decided to exploit it. His attempt at reform was justified. The Janissaries had indeed become a problem. Corruption, insubordination, cowardice on the battlefield. All of it was true. But Osman made a crucial mistake. He tried to destroy the most influential group in the empire without first building strong bases of support. He had no allies in the harem, his mother died early, and he had no powerful valide sultan, the sultan's mother, who traditionally was the most influential woman in the empire. Without this pillar of power, without a network of support, he was left alone. A lonely sultan against the Janissary corps was a doomed sultan. The lesson was harsh. Reforms without a political foundation are not reforms, but suicide. Osman II paid the highest price for this lesson. He was strangled by the very men he tried to command. However, his death had long-term consequences. It showed the entire empire that sultans could be killed, that the Janissaries held real power, and this realization poisoned Ottoman politics for the next 200 years. Every sultan who tried to change anything had to first contend with the Janissaries, and the Janissaries used this intimidation to block any reforms. As a result, the Ottoman Empire gradually deteriorated militarily, technologically, and economically. While Europe experienced the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, the empire clung to old methods because the Janissaries resisted change. Only Sultan Mahmud II in 1826 would have the courage and support to do what Osman had tried. The Janissary corps would be surrounded and destroyed by artillery. Thousands would die, the rest would be expelled. A 400-year tradition would be erased in one bloody day. But the cost of delay was enormous. 200 years of stagnation. 200 years of missed opportunities. For the Commonwealth, Khotyn represented something else. It was proof that even against overwhelming odds, courage and strategy could prevail. It was a moment of unity. The Polish nobility, Lithuanian magnates, the wild Zaporozhian Cossacks, all stood together. Not because they loved each other, but because all understood what would happen if they fell. This unity proved fragile. Just a year later, the Commonwealth returned to internal conflicts. The Sejm was paralyzed again. The nobility blocked taxes again. The Cossacks rebelled against Polish authority again. But the memory of Khotyn remained. The memory that when it was truly necessary, the Commonwealth could unite and fight. 62 years later, in 1683, Jan II Sobieski would lead Polish Hussars to the aid of Vienna. The Turks were again besieging a European city. Again, they had numerical superiority, and Sobieski, son of Jakub Sobieski, who negotiated the Khotyn Treaty, would remember his father's story. He would know that Turks could be defeated, that their armies, though huge, had weak points, that disciplined cavalry could break their formations, that well-used artillery could stop their onslaught, and at Vienna the Hussars would charge again, break through Turkish lines again, save Europe again, and the echoes of Khotyn would be heard in every hoofbeat, in every whistle of wings, in every cry of victory. Khotyn showed Europe that Ottoman expansion could be stopped. Not easily, not cheaply, but it was possible. And this lesson changed the psychology of the entire continent. The fear of the Turks, which had paralyzed European rulers since the fall of Constantinople, began to wane. The miracle at Khotyn demonstrated that perhaps the Habsburgs could retake Hungary, Venice could defend its possessions, and Rus could expand its borders southward. Over the next 2 centuries, Europe gradually gained the initiative. The Turks did not increase their holdings, they lost them. They defended, they attacked. The turning point was September 1621. The fields of Khotyn cut by trenches, soaked in the blood of Turks and a dying hetman who refused to bow his head. The numbers themselves speak volumes. Over 220,000 Turks and Tatars against 50,000 Poles, Lithuanians, and Cossacks. Ottoman losses ranged from 40,000 to 80,000, Polish from 3,000 to 5,000. The battle lasted 38 days, and by its end, only 1 barrel of gunpowder remained. 8 months later, the Sultan who led the invasion was strangled by his own soldiers. It was not just a skirmish, but a lesson of sorts. A lesson in how preparation surpasses improvisation, strategy surpasses strength, and discipline surpasses numerical superiority. It was a lesson that true leadership lies not in invincibility, but in creating a system that can survive even your passing. Chodkiewicz died on the battlefield, but his legacy endured. Sahidakni died from his wounds. However, the Cossacks remembered his tactics. Osman II was killed, but his attempts at reform served as a warning to future generations. At Khotyn, Polish and Turkish bones mingled in the earth. Enemies in life, they became equals in death. Witnesses to a battle that changed the fate of Europe. Witnesses to the day when 50,000 men defied 220,000, saying, "You shall not pass," and they did not pass. If this story has inspired you to reflect on courage, strategies, and resilience in the face of the impossible, share it in the comments. What struck you most about this battle? Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because more stories await you, narrating the battles that shaped our world. Stories of people who refused to give up, even when defeat seemed inevitable, because sometimes history is written not by the most numerous armies, but by the most steadfast people. Yeah, based on this story, please adapt the story into English, without changing the core content, in standard, complete, and grammatically correct English, without omitting content, with a length equivalent to the original, complete with everything. No summarization.